I'm just going to stop sharing for 1 second. I'm going to reshare.
All right. Well, I think we've got that respectable five past. Great. You want to go ahead and start the recording?
It's going.
Okay. All right. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Welcome on this potentially hot and muggy summer morning. But we're here because CRWA had this wonderful opportunity to review 25 phase one phosphorus control plans. And we are, squeezing in this time together before some, end of the year deadlines to see what we can learn from each other, to share back some of what we found and to see what we can all learn from each other. Next slide. So this is our agenda. I'm going to give a quick introduction and then kind of a high level summary of what we've seen reading these plans. Then we're going to have a breakout session. What we're imagining is 15 minutes for discussion in 4 small groups. And then we'll come back and we'll share and we'll let that discussion kind of run as long as it needs to. Then we're going to be talking about stormwater regulations. We're going to have another little discussion period. And then we'll be sharing kind of some of the interesting emerging strategies from the phosphorus control plans. And then finally, I'm hoping that we can all kind of get together and talk about what are some of the gaps and resources that we as a watershed or as a community of municipalities need. What are we missing? What can help us be successful? So this agenda is about 90 minutes long, and we may go to 2 hours depending on kind of how much discussion we have. All right, so we'll just kind of, and we'll get into it, and I'll say feel free to raise your hand at any point, put a question or a comment in the chat, but we'll have plenty of time for discussion in these breaks as well. Okay, next slide. So very, very big picture, we are here because we have clean water goals for the entire country. The Clean Water Act establishes that the waters of the United States should be swimmable and fishable. That was kind of re-sanctified in 1995 with the Clean Charles Initiative, which set a goal for a swimmable Charles by Earth Day 2005. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's wonderful to kind of take a moment to celebrate how far we have come. And this is a picture of the Charles River open swimming event, which happened just this last week, and I think was a huge success. My father swam the Charles and had such a good time doing it, and he could not resist just calling me immediately as he got out of the water, just feeling so excited to have this open water swimming experience in the middle of the city. And his comment to me was, the water didn't even taste bad. So I think that's a ringing endorsement of the success and what we get for all of the investment that's been made over the years. Next slide. So a little bit of just the very recent timeline. If we think of the Clean Charles Initiative as the beginning, and it's certainly not the beginning, but we can maybe think of it as the beginning of the kind of modern era of closing this gap to a swimmable river. There's a lot of major milestones. It took more than 20 years to get to the point where we had a TMDL that was in place and being implemented through a MS4 general permit. That started in 2018, as we all know. 2023, the phase 1 phosphorus control plans were drafted, and we're here in 2024. 2025 will be 30 years of the Clean Charles Initiative, and we're looking at another 15 years to get to the end of this MS4 permit cycle. So it's a long timeline, but just one of the things I do want to say at the outset is that we have already seen really substantial progress in the Charles River. Amazing decreases in concentration in phosphorus concentration since the mid 70s, which is when there first was water quality data that we have good access to. And just in the recent years, since 2023, we've seen statistically significant decreasing trends in phosphorus concentration for all reaches of the Charles River. And really all reaches of the Charles River are now getting to close to this 50 micrograms per liter threshold that tends to be associated with reduced harmful algal blooms and moving out of that really eutrophic state and moving into a healthier condition for a water body. Next slide. And just a little bit about where this workshop falls into all of that. CRWA is kind of building on a series of planning workshops that have been funded by Mass DEP through this municipal assistance grant program. And all of these were developed, with many folks who are here today, and especially the Charles River Municipal Stormwater Collaborative. 2021, 2022, we worked together to draft a phosphorus control plan template and to work through a series of exercises about how to credit public and private BMPs and how to assess current phosphorus loads. In 2023, we worked with the University of Vermont to develop an updated land use land cover map to really understand what's the current phosphorus loading from land use. And we're kind of using that map through some of this presentation today. And here in 2024, we have read the phosphorus control plans, and we're hoping that we can really report back and kind of reap some of the rewards of all this hard work that everybody has done. And one thing I just want to highlight is that all of this is available on our website on crwa.org/stormwater. And we will be updating this section to include, this webinar and the final report that comes from this grant and this work. All right, so we'll just kind of jump into it here. A little bit about the review process. This was kind of an iterative process, but we started with 25 of the available phosphorus control plans. We read a few of them together. We had some discussions about what can we really track, what's consistent across each of these documents. And we came up with a list of about 50 qualitative and quantitative parameters. We reviewed these plans as a team of 4, myself, Jeremy Green, Jamie Houle from UNH, and Elizabeth Bouchard from UNH Stormwater Center. That data, especially the qualitative data, was kind of put in one, big gigantic spreadsheet. And then we worked through that to kind of extract some information about trends and kind of how we're doing as a whole. And then just kind of one thing I want to say at the front of this is that CRWA is obviously not a regulatory agency. We're not, we're seeing our role in this process simply as sharing information, identifying trends, understanding how are we doing as an entire watershed, and what kind of identifying gaps, what's missing, what more can we do to make sure that we meet our clean water goals. Next slide. So a little bit of kind of what we'll be going through today. We kind of took some of the numbers out of the qualitative section of this review, and we're going to look a little bit at where are we now. So what have towns done to get to their existing implementations? What implementations are in place today? And then the next step is, where are we going? How are our towns planning to meet that 10-year milestone, that 25% required reduction? And we looked at that in a couple of different ways. We looked at, what are the kind of existing controls, short-term implementation, what's long-term planning, and then trying to understand, where are what types of projects are being used to meet these requirements. And then finally, we'll work through this a little bit more. This is going to be something that's a bit more in the final report than in this presentation. But what are the recommendations and best practices that can come from this review? Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of going to be the dry section of our discussion here, and then we'll get into the more subjective part. Okay, next slide. So this graph, we can kind of just take it in for a second. The purple lines show the amount of phosphorus load change between 2005 and 2021 due to land use. And the teal on the other side of the line shows the reductions due to BMP implementation. And I imagine some of you might be saying, hey, that's not exactly what we report in our phosphorus control plan. And something I'm just going to highlight is that there was a wide range of strategies that towns and their consultants used to calculate their current phosphorus load. It was very variable. We don't want that to be the focus of our work here today. So what we did is we did this using a methodology that was very consistent with how the loads were assigned in the first place in the TMDL. And there's a couple things that I kind of want to highlight here. In total, loading in the watershed has increased by about 6,000 pounds per year. And just within these 25 towns that we have complete data for, that number is more like 3,500 pounds. During that same period, the existing BMPs are offsetting 2,400 pounds per year of that increased phosphorus load. So, that's, I'm going to say that's 70% of the phosphorus load from these 25 towns. 70% of the new phosphorus load is offset by existing BMPs. And I think another thing that's really interesting is that if you look at the whole watershed, actually for the median town, the increase in phosphorus load was only only about 20 or 40 pounds of increase. So for the median town, there's not a lot of increase, but of that increase, so of the 3,500 additional pounds of phosphorus load, about 80% of that came from four towns that are really developing very quickly: Milford, Franklin, Dedham, and Watertown. So I think that's to me, a very interesting story that kind of pops right out as we start to do this review. Next slide. So, takeaway number one, or observation number one: loading has increased, but the BMP implementation, at least as it's being credited for these 25 towns, has not kept up with increases in loading. Next slide.
Hey, Max, can I just jump in there?
Yeah, please.
One of the things this really underscores, for me anyway, looking at all the work that was done, is this transition from, I guess, a planning economy to an implementation economy, right? We know that land use is changing. Depending on how you do it, you can do it a million different ways, and we saw it every which way. The loading or the baseline can be calculated and recalculated. That all is kind of, all of that is a guess. But what we know moving forward, as this observation underscores, is that implementation, it's an implementation game. So, the focus is really shifting to the structural and non-structural controls that reduce the load. And then CRWA will keep up with the monitoring at the receiving water, which is where it really counts. And you saw the benefits of all the great work that's been done in those beginning slides. So implementation, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, and then another thing that we kind of just looked at is, how are we doing as a cohort of municipalities meeting our 10-year goal? And there are towns that are very far along. There are towns that are very close to meeting their 10-year requirement just with existing implementations. There are towns that are, pretty far along. And then there are towns that, really that implementation is almost all going to happen in the next 5 years. Okay, and I will pause just to take this question from Luchika. Yeah, Amber, do you want to just back up to that bar graph again? So Luchika asks a great question, which is, how much of the P load increase or decrease is due to data inaccuracy? And I think that the accuracy here, or the kind of error from the change in mapping, is about plus or minus 5%. And we think it's actually slightly biased to the negative 5%. So we have a little bit of documentation on that, but that's our best guess right now, Luchika. I don't know if you want to hop in and say anything else about that, but yes, as we updated these maps, we have much finer resolution impervious layers, and I think those in many cases actually shrink the impervious, shrink the number of pixels that are considered to be impervious based on new mapping. All right, we can go back to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, so on the whole, we're about a third of the way with existing implementations to the 10-year milestone. And the median town is a quarter of the way. And, that's maybe not a surprise to anybody, because, the concept here is that is that the first 5 years is for planning and the next 5 years is for implementation. Next slide. So just kind of here's another way to look at that. We found it helpful when reviewing these phosphorus control plans to think about short-term and long-term planning efforts. There are towns that have projects that are in engineering or that have a timeline that are going to help them get to their 10-year milestone. We're distinguishing that from kind of the long-term planning, which are projects that have a strategy or maybe have been identified, oh, we could do something in this area or we could use this approach at these sites generally. So, for the most part, there's kind of a small pipeline of these short-term projects that are really fleshed out and ready to go. And a lot of the implementation that's going to happen in the next 5 years is from projects that are, that are kind of more at the conceptual level, that don't necessarily have locations yet, that don't necessarily have timelines yet, but have a general strategy behind them. So, second observation, to kind of get to our 10-year milestones, we're thinking of it as implementation, but there's also a big planning effort that's still needed to get from these kind of conceptual level designs to really specific projects that can be implemented. Okay, and now, this was something that I found very interesting as we were kind of categorizing, where are these phosphorus reductions coming from for existing projects? And what you shared in your phosphorus control plans is that, about a third of these existing phosphorus credits are coming from public projects, projects from private development, and non-structural practices, so catch basin cleaning and street sweeping. But as we look towards the future, the planning has really, really focused on implementation of BMPs on public property. Next slide. So this observation, existing BMPs are evenly split between public, private, and non-structural. And then we'll go ahead and I'll hand this over to Jamie to talk a little bit about how folks are approaching future planning.
All right, next slide. Yeah, so very interesting. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and we noticed many strategies. Some communities have done a really good job at taking credit for existing BMPs. Some communities didn't even count any, right? So there's a lot of learning and a lot of innovation, I think, that's happening as well. What we found with the plans is that in the existing credit, communities that we're taking credit pretty evenly across the board for public structural controls, for private structural controls, and then for their non-structural activities. So it's pretty even across the board. And then we have this unspecified. I mean, this is kind of the innovative things, because as we're talking, the baseline numbers are constantly changing as we refine our data and get more accurate information. And then the implementation credits are in flux as well. So it's an exciting time, but also and really an innovative time. So as we move into this era of implementation, we're going to see a broad range of approaches that'll benefit us to share and compare notes and to kind of coalesce around those successful implementation strategies. So when we look at the future and the planning, we see that a lot more focus is on the municipal lands. And this is kind of as directed. So this makes sense. We're focusing on municipally owned lands and the opportunities therein to retrofit and get larger load reductions. But we didn't see really a lot more planning on the private side. That kind of makes sense too, because again, lots of moving parts here. We have the RDA potentially moving in that could take advantage of the biggest of the largest of the large commercial properties that are sort of non-conforming now. And so there'll be assistance with that. And then the non-structural controls, we're not sure it's possible that, they were tapped out in the planning phase. So people are calculating credits for the catch basin cleaning and street sweeping. But therein lies a lot of excitement and for innovation as well. We know that credits around sweeping will likely change and might be more comprehensive to do more enhanced sweeping for phosphorus load reduction. And we know that there's all kinds of other things. There's a lot of resurgence of rain harvesting as well, rain barrel programs for small, widespread implementation across the community, and small but building load reduction. So, and we'll hear stories from what innovative stuff Franklin is doing later on. And then we have, I guess, the unspecified. This is where, there's some potential magic, right? Because we have changing credits, we have changing approaches, and we have, some innovative ideas emerging that we're going to need time to kind of chew on as a community and really think through. But there's prospect there for really emergent and innovative strategies to better reduce phosphorus reduction. So we'll continue to, develop those strategies necessary and create the collaboration needed to kind of move these things forward. So do you want this back, Max?
Yeah, we can riff on this together, but I'll just kind of go through it quickly. If we look at those existing public strategies, if we look, if we zoom in on, okay, what is making up these public projects? Are they large projects? Are they small projects? Are they projects that are kind of implemented systematically on a right of way? What we see is that for existing projects, they're mostly pretty small projects. They're projects that are, in the 1 to 2 pounds phosphorus removal per project, or even less than 1 pound. But the future planning is very focused on these larger projects, kind of centralized projects that can get greater than 5 pounds of phosphorus removal kind of in one project. Next slide. And, I think this makes a lot of sense, kind of something on the cost tracking end. Folks who have been with us through a couple iterations of this workshop know that we have seen $100,000 per pound of phosphorus removal as a median value throughout the watershed. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing that number move down a little bit for projects that are captured by these phosphorus control plans. On average, the smaller projects are having cost estimation that's about $65,000 per pound phosphorus removal. And the larger projects are even below that, less than $44,000 per pound. And then, of course, neither of those numbers can really compete with the cost effectiveness of non-structural controls and tracking and certifying private projects. Next slide. And then we just wanted to take a second to kind of highlight, what we're seeing as like a very classic type of public project that a lot of towns are identifying. These are projects where towns are finding a way to divert existing stormwater flows from, from a stormwater main on a roadway into a public parcel, and then do substantial subsurface infiltration. This is Pierce Playground in Brookline and Milford Town Park, and both of these projects, use somewhat similar strategies, and are able to achieve north of 25 pounds phosphorus removal. So yeah, the observation here is that, right now, I think as towns are figuring out how do we get to that 25% reduction, the focus is really on these larger, cost-effective public projects where, you can do 5 or 10 of these projects and hopefully meet your goals. All right, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit and get into the breakout rooms. And I think so there looks like there's 45 of us, so we'll split into 4 rooms, and there's going to be someone from our project team in each room. And the goal is to just react and reflect to what we're hearing today. From this presentation, what observations stand out to you, but also from your experience, drafting this phosphorus control plan, what do you want to highlight? What do you want to bring to the group? So we'll have 15 minutes in these small groups, and then Amber is going to bring us back in, and we'll do kind of a share out and discussion based on that.
Okay, I'm going to start them momentarily and just take a look at, I guess, the screen and the questions, just in case it disappears when I start the breakout rooms, which it probably will.
Okay. It looks like we're all back together here. Interested to hear what folks talked about. Um, Jeremy, is there someone from your group who's ready to report out?
Um, I can report out if that's maybe the easiest because we
Okay.
covered a variety of things. I think sort of two big things are this idea, sort of understanding why and where that focus on the public planning comes from, because obviously it's the parcels that municipalities have control over. And sort of at the same time, though, there's the fact that these parcels are not unlimited, and so some of that planning will probably eventually run into hurdles in the future that may mean it doesn't necessarily happen. But at the same time, with private development and non-structural, there's assumptions about future development that are potentially going to get even better as regulations strengthen. And then with the new non-structural credits, kind of this idea that there's implementation there that doesn't show up in our data because there's no numbers for it yet, but it's relatively concrete that it will hopefully continue to grow. And then definitely I think some concerns about the load change due to development and how it differs from what communities reported. And I think maybe it behooves us to kind of dig into that deeper and not necessarily, hold up either side as the be all end all, because I think the bigger point is about sort of the potential inconsistencies. And so definitely I think some more work to do there. And then we had a good discussion about um the private structural BMPs and how maybe the number on cost that we reported is potentially obviously right now in the early stages for certain communities, but from people who have experience working on that side of things, it's a hefty task, and that cost in terms of money or in terms of man hours is potentially a huge overestimate and even or an underestimate, sorry, and potentially even more so depending on how much of the workload on RDA oversight the EPA just ends up delegating to the communities. Max, I think you're muted at the moment.
Oh, thank you. No, that echoes a lot of what we were talking about in our group too. Stephanie, would you mind kind of sharing our conversation a little bit?
Sure. So we did talk a little bit about costs and how, how things on capital, capital plans are, it's a lot and it's going to be a lot to handle the next 5 years. And then we talked a lot about the non-structural controls and how, some towns had kind of reported that they were going to take a lot of credit through non-structural controls, including myself. And then after having done, gone through 1 year of the, trying to implement this, it's just not feasible and it's not working out how it intended. So that's going to have to get adjusted. And then also that graph, which was very powerful. I think a lot of people took a lot out of that graph to see how the changes in land use and the changes in loads and how it's just it varies so much across the watershed. But I think we were kind of saying how it's important to look at that and to watch it, but maybe it's not something that towns necessarily have to keep up with. And maybe our role is to just keep implementing things. We talked about the importance of just putting things in the ground and getting projects done, because whether it, you're gaining, another 100 pounds of phosphorus removal, or maybe some of the reporting there's less, 50 pounds less that you have to do. It's still a lot. So just keeping on the track to just putting things in the ground and completing projects was a big thing we talked about in our group. I don't know if I probably missed stuff, Max. Oh, you're on mute.
I'll just add that I think there was just general concern about how expensive it's going to be to implement structural controls. Julie, do you want to share, or is there someone from your group who could share back?
Happy to. I got some notes from our conversation, which was great. It sounds like echoing some of the other discussion. Conversations on the baseline calculation, really that just taking up too much time, prone to errors, prone to different methodologies between communities, leading to lack of comparability, and just errors in accomplishing the ultimate goal here potentially. So a lot of discussion on that. Maybe an ask for EPA to step up a bit more the way they did the original baselines. Zach also mentioned the need to maybe standardize, and I see some chat conversations about this too. How are we talking about costs, just to kind of allow us to better understand that across the watershed and across and over time as we implement these. There was a comment, one community was surprised by the amount of credit that some communities are taking for non-structural activities. So maybe a learning opportunity there to, see what different folks are doing in the non-structural arena and how folks are maximizing those credits, at least the folks that are maximizing those credits. And then we were, when we closed out, we were mid-discussion on this challenging issue of certifying and tracking private BMPs. What is the best time investment there? How just logistically are people doing that? How are you kind of maximizing your staff time to credit ratio on that, as opposed to tracking down every little dry well in a residential driveway? And that's where we wrapped up. Well, actually, I should say, if my group wants to clarify anything, they can chime in. All right.
And anybody who wants to kind of jump in, please do so. But if not, Jamie, is there someone from your group, or you want to summarize your discussion?
I can do that. And it's amazing to me how similar the conversations are. I think, we had similar discussions to every group. We talked extensively about how it's hard to track BMPs, especially on private properties, and that likely those credits are underrepresented in the overall plans, right? Because of the same question about, do I dedicate staff time to track all this information down, and or is it worth it? So that might be part of the resources moving forward to really develop a panel to kind of review this and kind of standardize ways of potentially accounting for these things. We did have the same discussion about the background and the loading, and Max, I was nervous about that slide because someone echoed something that really resonated with me about this focus on implementation, because we had this discussion about in the new baseline, if you're a small town and your impervious cover decreased, are you done, or do you have to do anything? And I think the resounding answer to that would be no, but it could be that small towns may have required different strategies. Maybe they don't need robust structural implementation programs. Maybe they need to really work on refining their regulations, or fine-tuning their non-structural controls. So there could be differences between small towns and larger towns, obviously, in the watershed. There was some discussion about, could there be the fact that all these strategies are different and are being calculated differently in every community. Could there be office hours or technical assistance hours where we develop, again, commonalities around this? So moving from, a variety of methods to at least consistent methods, so that we're all doing things similar. So as the science changes, we can, easily incorporate that into our methods. And then just a comment that progress to date has been impressive, and that the load reductions are larger than anticipated. So, that's another, I think we're all warmed by some of those introductory slides and seeing the response to all these efforts within the Charles, and really happy that and hopeful that that continues.
I love that idea of office hours to kind of standardize some of these practices. And I know there is a lot of peer conversations already happening, like through the Municipal Stormwater Collaborative. But I think I think there could be a lot of opportunity to do more, so people aren't just scratching their heads in private.
It is interesting to me too that these conversations are happening. Like in NUIA, we've been having these discussions, and NUIA is largely populated by a lot of the towns and the consultants that work for the towns. And, we've had multiple sessions on these very ideas. So, there's already kind of little starter groups that have been working on these things. And it seems like maybe more collaboration and more kind of solidarity in our efforts. It's something that we might benefit from.
All right. Well, yeah. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Anything that kind of wasn't captured in this conversation? Yeah, Zach.
Hey guys. I was wondering, I'm looking at the participants here. Do we have anybody representing EPA Region 1 on the call?
Yeah, I saw Danielle Cato.
Okay, so we do. So I know we have, some new staff there, or newish, with some of the transitions in on the regulatory side. So, these are really good conversations for them to be hearing with us. So I'm sure, Max, I'm assuming there's some kind of report out, and we're recording this anyway. So, as far as being able to, help provide their staff with some feedback, I think would be good to get this in their hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we'll be sharing the final report from this, and we should also, I think I really want to make sure that we kind of have consensus behind. I'm hoping that this process can help us build some consensus behind some recommendations. And obviously the MS4 permit is going to be renewed soon, and the RDA is coming out soon, and I'm hoping that all of this can kind of help us gear up to be on the same page about what we'd like to see in those permits. But so one I'm hearing, that we are feeling, and I think I'm hearing in our conversation, is that it would be nice for the responsibility for calculating current loading to be shifted from the towns to the EPA, and for that to be a more standardized practice, to leave the towns freer to just focus on implementation and tracking.
Yeah, and I just maybe one more comment on that. When in a recent conversation that I was able to have with Lynn Jennings, who's heading the permit section for EPA Region 1, Lynn kind of implied that the draft permit wasn't done yet, and that there may be still opportunity for us as a community to have some influence on some of the crediting policy in the new permit, which I think is important. I haven't done anything about it, but I just want to kind of throw it out to the collective group here that, it seems like EPA Region 1 might be looking for some feedback on how we could get, crediting policy written into the permit to give us more flexibility on kind of new changes. What we're dealing with right now in the crediting policy is like, once it's baked into the permit, we're stuck with it until there's a new permit written and promulgated, which can really leave a huge gap in, like, if we come to some new scientific conclusion about something or some approach or process, and then we can't really take credit for it until a new permit is promulgated, that can be a 10 or 15-year gap in time. And so, if we could, I'm just going to throw it out to the group. Like, if there's any creative thoughts on how that could be done, we may want to provide it to our friends at EPA, and it may be something, Max, for you guys to think about too, because we want to be able to take advantage of innovative approaches as soon as we can for the good of the river and for the good of load reduction, and not from an administrative perspective get hung up on, well, we can't do that action because we're not going to get credit for it. So anyway, just throw that out there too, and I'll be quiet.
No, thanks, Zach. That's really helpful. I mean, and there were a number of towns who identified what amount of credit they would be able to get if the non-structural credits were updated kind of along the lines of that clean sweep memo. And it is a bit of a challenge that just nobody knows, what's going to be in the new permit, and it can't really, folks are going to have to plan on the fly once that comes out. Yeah, Maria.
I just wanted to follow up with what Zach said, and we would be happy in Brookline to join a letter or help craft a letter to EPA asking for specific actions, perhaps like looking at the Clean Sweep New Hampshire thing that you mentioned, Zach. And I don't know the content of that, but it sounded like it was something that you felt was provided a lot of the data necessary to get us the credits that would be more appropriate for our communities. So if a bunch of people were willing to work on it, I think we could craft a letter to EPA before the draft permit. And then if they don't follow us, and we individually all write letters saying, hey, we wrote to you before you even drafted the permit.
Yeah, Luchika.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Newt has said in the past that they are looking at those street sweeping credits.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah,
they're
we're
already
all
considering
expecting
those.
something. Yeah.
They are, but I think he's also said that so there's two different methods that were updated in Clean Sweep. One is a updated modeled credit, and one is a measured credit. And by far, the measured credit almost provides an order of magnitude increase in phosphorus reduction through that approach. However, Newt has said that it's more difficult to write into a permit, whereas the model is very easy to write into a permit. I would sign on to any letter that advocated for the measured approach, because I think what we found in our studies is that it's more reflective of the actual load being collected. And so that is the big push. If they adopt an updated model credit, you're going to get a little bit more, but it's not going to be really incentivizing for a full-scale sweeping program, such as the measured credit would be. So there's a pretty big difference, and I think we'd all benefit from them advancing what we've recommended they adopt, which is the measured approach.
Thank you, Jamie, for that clarification. I always assumed it was the not the model, but the weight.
Yeah, and we've developed the weight has been a problem because not everybody can weigh their captured sediments, but we've developed a regression that can, as long as you can estimate volume, which I think everybody does a pretty good job at, that you can measure it in weight, or you can estimate volume and apply the regression and get the credit.
Thanks, Jamie. Jessica?
Hi, I apologize if this was covered. I had to jump off for a bit. As far as structural BMP controls, do we know if there's any plans from the EPA to give credit for like jellyfish structures, contact structures, those types of proprietary structures that do treat for phosphorus?
I can answer that. Yes, there are plans. We're working on those curves. As you know, they don't currently exist. More the high flow rate media filters don't exist. I don't know, the jellyfish is a membrane filter as opposed to like the focal point or some of the contact systems, which are high flow rate media filters. I don't know if there's going to be differentiation between those, but we are working on a high flow rate media filter curve right now. It's just time.
And is that would be covering a number of different proprietary structures? It would just have to meet specs. Okay. And do we expect that might be actually issued sometime soon, or I'm just curious for some of our clients who are really limited on space?
We should be completed with that in February of next year. And then, I don't know how long it's going to take to filter up into actually the adoption of the credit. That's we should have a model. And we have established a way to petition EPA for credit. So Focal Point did petition EPA. We looked at their system, and I think EPA did submit a relative performance curve that could be used to assess that system. So I think it's the hybrid biofiltration curve.
Thank you.
All right. Well, while we're kind of talking about it, I'd love to solicit if there's any other kind of big topics that we'd like to collectively raise with EPA for this next general permit, talking about non-structural credits, a more flexible framework for changing credits in between permit issuances, and then updated credits for proprietary systems. Is there anything else that's that folks have been kind of paying attention to?
Max, I was going to say, Jamie just kind of reminded me that, like that Focal Point, I think that has been like accepted as creditable. Maybe that's a model for like other structural, new structural things, and also changes to non-structural science. So, maybe that's a good model. Like if they, that particular control wasn't in the permit for credit, but they've allowed it now. Maybe there's something there related to kind of the future permit to allow that kind of, again, where EPA could issue, and I don't know what it is. I don't, but some kind of technical memo that's available for public comment or something. Because I think the issue, and it'd be fun to talk to the regulator, the permit writers about this, but I think the issue is like, how do you ensure that all of what's in the permit is has passed public comment? I think that's kind of the issue, is like there's a concern that if you put like the credit manual outside of the permit itself, and it was like, the permit referenced a credit manual that could be changed at any time, that skirts the public process. And I think that's kind of the EPA's concern, just from a very administrative permit writing perspective. So anyway, I think continuing the conversation with them and with the, for CRWA to be involved with that, I think is good, because, you guys represent the environmental community to some extent, and, making sure we're doing it so it passes all the straight face tests, but gives us the flexibility to adopt and adapt to new science and technology, I think is really important. And Jamie just reminded me that Focal Point thing has been done. So how did that work? And is that a functional mechanism?
Thanks, Zach. Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Max. This has been a great presentation so far. Just one sort of overarching point that probably is a lot of our minds, and then I have a specific sort of opening Pandora's box question. So the big overarching, of course, is thinking about the stormwater reg changes, proposed trade changes that DEP is looking at. And I know we have Liz Clark on the webinar, but thinking about, and I know the goal is for DEP and EPA to sort of align the requirements with the MS4. I know like the DEP stormwater draft regulations started looking at, giving credits for rain barrels and other things. I think Jamie spoke briefly about that too as a possibility. But just making sure, while EPA is starting to draft the new MS4 permit, making sure that DEP and EPA are aligning that. And I know, the Mass State Stormwater Coalition that Maria Rose is part of, and many of you are also are highlighting that. So just wanted to mention that as a big overarching let's hope that that happens. And then this is completely separate from stock, but it's so like high in my mind because I see it all the time, is thinking about stormwater management. We're talking about implementation. And I think from a local level, especially the conservation departments, the planning departments, we look so much at maintenance and making sure people are maintaining and monitoring. And it just blows my mind. And maybe this doesn't happen in big cities. I don't know, what the comparison would be. But, I just visited a condo, complex in Lincoln that was built in 2007, and it still had filter fabric, old and lichen covered, covering some of the outfalls that clearly, should have been removed. And, of course, small towns struggle with doing proper inspections and having experts, that can really look at the stormwater design. We expect when permits are closed, the engineer certifying that stuff was done. And, I'm having to go out there tomorrow actually and deal with this with the current facility owners. And these, we're getting inspections from annual inspections saying everything's working well. And I go out there and I see filter fabric covering catch basins from, 15 plus years ago. So I can't help but feel so conflicted about, yes, we need to create better implementation. We need to lower our phosphorus levels. And at the same time, I see at a local level how many commercial and industrial sites probably aren't properly maintaining their stormwater systems. So I just wanted to share my internal conflict about, how do we move forward when we can't even get the basic maintenance of some of this infrastructure being dealt with, at a local level either.
I'm just writing this down. Yeah, that's a very striking example of a lack of maintenance. Yeah, James, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks. Just to add on to that, something that we're looking into is determining what exactly a certified stormwater inspector is. For a large system, it might be pretty obvious to everyone that we have a PE, but that may not be practical for all the smaller systems. So any guidance that we can get with regards to that for a future crediting program, who will be able to inspect an SCM so that the EPA deems it'll get credit for whatever it's calculated to get, is a big point to consider moving forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
I would just say that not to make that complicated though, because the vast majority of infiltration systems really don't need much maintenance. If you've got a storm tech system, they don't need a lot of maintenance, but there should be some simple checks that like a private homeowner could do a self-certification. At least that's what I'm hoping here. But to be aware of it, because unfortunately it's an awareness issue too, I think, Michelle, not just, that there's people neglecting to do it. But the filter fabric thing, I feel like that's at the end of construction. They just want to get out of there and let the people move in so quickly. There's this disconnect at the end of construction, unfortunately. Plus, sometimes they just break it anyway when it floods. I'm surprised they didn't just break it when it floods the streets.
Yeah, and this has been a big topic of conversation in the recent technical assistance series that some of us have been working on with the EPA. And I'll just share very quickly kind of a couple things from that series. We spoke with some folks from Lowell who are kind of rolling out a self-certification program. And their concept is to do these self-certifications and then to kind of check on a very select few of them as a way to just, incentivize compliance, not necessarily capture every single one. And then, Jamie, you can probably share this yourself, but, Jamie has been working with many towns to kind of come up with like a very, very, very simplified checklist. So that's kind of the other approach. Yeah, Jamie, do you want to just kind of talk about your philosophy there, or where you see that headed?
Well, I mean, as you know, this was in the MS4 permit. It was due in year 3 in New Hampshire and Mass, and we had VHB develop a inspection and maintenance program for us, and again, it was dense. It was dense, and so we don't see anything implemented. The self-certification was developed in the Mystic during that technical assistance, and this is the first time we've seen actual implementation take place. And it's pretty straightforward, you know, just signing off that. So you're sending a letter out to your permitted authorities, and they're sending a certified letter back. I don't think we designated like who is who needs to fill it out. The owner needs to fill it out, and you know, signs on the dotted line. So we're not requiring necessarily a PE or even a CPESH but you know, they send you information back certifying that maintenance is happening. And the thing that we're hearing back is, you know, that takes at least 1 FTE, a full-time equivalent staff to administer. So again, we know operation and maintenance is huge. And I think of this going to climate change when we're looking at controlling the 100-year event, which seems crazy to me. Not just the 100-year event, Atlas 14, the 100-year event at the 95th confidence interval, right? Crazy. And then we can't even assure that you've taken the fabric off the catch basin inlet and that your inlet's actually hydraulically working as appropriate. You know, it's like, if we can't solve the simple, how do we get to these more comprehensive things? It's a great question. I don't have an answer. I mean, we're working on it. It's baby steps, but definitely an elephant in the room. And then Max, just for posterity, I'm going to throw out impervious cover disconnection. This is something that's been emerging, and I've watched everybody using Sutherland equations appropriately or inappropriately, and I feel like you're leaving credits, you're taking credits off the table. If we use the impervious cover disconnection curves that are already in Appendix F, we can actually credit that the impervious cover that's not directly connected. We can develop phosphorus credits with the impervious cover disconnection tool. So I think, again, moving forward, we should be evaluating those tools and then categorizing that maybe with interns, or again, this is something that it would be a small cost for a huge potential load reduction associated with the categorized impervious cover disconnection. And there'll be more on that. I just want to throw that out there to add to the list.
Let's take a couple more and then we'll kind of move through the rest of the presentation. But I see Maria, Luchika, and then Zach.
Oh, sorry, I didn't lower my hand. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, Luchika and then Zach.
Just quick question, Jamie, for the impervious disconnection. Is that a GIS desktop analysis that you envision?
Unfortunately, it's not.
Right? Oh no, that's a good thing.
Unfortunately, so it would be when you're assessing your municipally owned lands. Part of that could be impervious cover disconnection. What I'm saying is, previously there's been a lot of desktop analysis that use Sutherland equations to estimate directly connected impervious, and basically you're taking all the disconnected off the table, right? So it's not. You're taking off the ledger, if you will, through the adaptation of the Sutherland equations. You can use on a site-by-site basis, and again, this is going to take time, but site-by-site basis, you can evaluate and actually use the impervious cover disconnection curves to get phosphorus reduction, load reduction credit for what is disconnected on those municipally owned lands.
And yeah, I'll just chime in here, but I'll shout out to Sarah Nalvin, who's on the call, who's done a lot of really great work thinking about this. And Sarah shared something with me that I thought was really insightful, which is, you know, when you are taking credit for impervious disconnection, you're also tracking that impervious disconnection as a BMP and taking responsibility for making sure you're not eroding a gully out of your parking lot into, you know, into a wetland or into a field. So I think that that's yeah, I'll just kind of add that comment very quickly. Yeah, Zach, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think this is a good reminder, Jamie, and kind of an exciting topic. You know, one thing we've been contemplating is you know, spending the time, labor, resources, and or, you know, municipal money to actually go site by site to look at disconnected and connected impervious for individual facilities. And one thing comes to mind when the Long Creek RDA went through back in the late 2000s, DEP actually spent an entire summer in that small watershed with interns looking at all of the connected and disconnected impervious by site, because under the RDA, at least in Maine, any of the portions of a parcel that were not connected, directly connected, were not regulated under the RDA. So the landowners, the participating landowners, only had to pay in or were only permitted for the connected impervious, which is something interesting. I'm not sure I've heard any of that from EPA yet around the RDA. I think they're still just, I mean, obviously it's such a bigger scale, you know, it's a tremendous amount of labor resources to do that. But I think in some communities, it may be in your best interest to spend some time on your municipal and private facilities, actually looking at connected, disconnected, and seeing how that compares to, you know, what you're calcing, you know, related to Sutherland, because it could be very much, to Jamie's point, in your favor. And I think it's probably worth it. And it might be worth a little pilot somewhere to kind of do that. I don't know, Jamie or Max, is that happening in any communities where, you know, we're looking at a small portion of the watershed and saying, okay, this is what we calculated for export, but then when we go actually look at individual parcels, this is what we see. Just a thought.
It's not happening, but it should. It's a good idea.
Okay.
But I think we're still trying to wrap our heads around this, right? Because, so it's something to advocate for sure.
Yeah, exciting. All right. Well, I think that's a great conversation, and hopefully we'll find a way to follow up with that. Yeah, and I will just say, yeah, Sarah Nelvin's been working with DCR, and I think maybe DCR has taken this approach maybe a bit farther than municipalities at this point. So good place to start if you're interested in that conversation. Talk to Sarah about how they've pursued that and how that's reflected in the SNEP retrofit manual. All right, well, moving on a little bit to it, I think another topic that, yeah, we should definitely do that. Thank you, Lucica. That's an excellent suggestion. We will have a follow-up on this on impervious disconnection. We should brainstorm about kind of what's the next step we'd all like to see together on this. Great. Put a pin in that. That's very helpful. All right, well, let's move on to this next slide, and we're going to talk kind of quickly about stormwater regulations. Yeah, Amber, do you want to advance that slide deck? Give it one more click. So the, you know, just to kind of ground us back in this presentation, you know, we've seen that about a third of the existing phosphorus reductions come from private development, notwithstanding everything that was just shared about the challenges and limitations of crediting private development and maintaining private development. You know, this is, I think we can think of it. It's not free, but it is potentially low-hanging fruit. It's phosphorus reductions that are less expensive to a town compared to developing their own projects. There's a couple things that we want to highlight. You know, kind of the prompt here is it's worth it to go beyond the state requirements. And there are two ways to think about the performance standards for stormwater regulations. I think the simplest are, you know, what's the disturbance threshold that triggers stormwater regulations, and then what's the performance standard? What do those BMPs have to achieve? You know, if you haven't kind of seen this work already, the EPA did some great work on this holistic water framework. They did some analysis, or there was analysis in New Hampshire and also in the Taunton River watershed that kind of showed similar things, which is that if we are only focusing on parcels that are greater than 1 acre, that's potentially just a third of phosphorus loading. But if we can reduce that standard down to 1/4 of an acre, we're going to start to be able to capture more like 80% of the impervious area that's in our watershed or in our municipality. And then the other piece of this is, what's your required phosphorus reduction? And this is something that, I find really interesting, and I also find a bit frustrating because we have standards, for required retention, and then we also have standards for phosphorus reduction. And those standards don't really match each other very well. And this is this is that performance curve for, really good infiltrating soils, 8.27 inches per hour, like an A soil. But even for poor draining soils, if you are retaining the first inch of water, you're probably getting a 90% reduction. And there are many towns that require retention of that first inch, but only stipulate that there be a 60% reduction in total phosphorus. So I think that there's a disconnection there that we can focus on. But big picture, if we can capture smaller projects with stormwater regulations, and if we can require higher standards for those projects, we're going to be able to do more on the private development end. Next slide. And here are just kind of 3 examples of stormwater regulations that kind of go beyond the minimum. Just to be pretty quick about this, I think that the city of Cambridge in particular has done a really good job detailing what it costs to inspect and permit phosphorus reductions from new development. And maybe Cambria can pipe up and speak about that in this kind of discussion as we get into that. But Newton is another example of a community that has strong regulations that capture smaller projects and are really protective. And then finally, Watertown, I think, is really kind of the Cadillac of stormwater regulations within our watershed. In Watertown, even relatively small projects trigger their stormwater review. So if you're doing a conversion of a single family home to a 2-family home, even if you're not adding new impervious area, you have to meet their requirement to retain the volume of a 100-year storm on your property. And obviously, that type of requirement goes far, far beyond a water quality requirement. And now we're really going into something that's going to touch flooding and climate resilience. I just wanted to, I think the idea here there are a lot of different ways to do this. Many different communities have found different ways to go beyond the state minimum requirements for stormwater regulations. This can be really, really a powerful tool. Next slide. And I just want to bring in something from the climate compact work, which is, the climate compact team, Julie Wood and Weston and Sampson, ran a scenario looking at whether the Watertown rule were to be adopted throughout the watershed. And what this shows is that this type of stormwater regulation, really has the potential to offset and mitigate the changes in precipitation that we're seeing from climate change. So I know this conversation is really about how do we meet our nutrient reduction goals, but I think stormwater regulations in particular are a place where, climate resilience, flood prevention, and nutrient reduction kind of come together. All right, next slide. So in this next breakout room, we want to kind of encourage folks to just reflect on what their current stormwater regulations are. Are they working for you? How many projects do you review in a typical year? What challenges and opportunities do you see for considering more stringent stormwater regulations? And we will drop this prompt in the chat as well, so that folks have the ability to to look at it as we go into these breakout rooms.
Okay, I'm going to start the breakout rooms, and I will drop that into the chat as you guys get set up.
Thank you, Amber. Okay. Sorry about that. We just we got cut off in a great conversation that was heating up a little bit. But yeah, I'll report back quickly for our group. We were lucky to have both Dedham and Cambridge in our small group, and that they both have really strong stormwater regulations. And I'll just share a bit about Dedham, and Jason, feel free to jump in at any point. I'll just say what stuck out to me. But Dedham does something really smart where they have a two-tiered stormwater permit, and they really don't distinguish very much between development and redevelopment. If you trigger their permit, you trigger their permit. And a lot of projects have to meet a 65% phosphorus reduction or 2-inch infiltration, retention and infiltration on site. And yeah, this sounds like a very successful program. And Jason was sharing kind of some of their strategy about requiring certification to be submitted to the town. Well, we'll leave it there, and maybe we can all go around and kind of see where the conversation takes us. Yeah, Julie, do you want to share from your group?
Yes, I'll share kind of we had great conversations as well, covered a bunch of stuff. I'm going to share kind of our two most interesting findings maybe. Since I know we're short on time, one, we did discuss the permits, the annual permits, and our range was 1 a year up to 1 to 2,000 a year. So a lot of variety in what folks are seeing come across their desks. And that was, on the low end were the more rural communities, Lincoln and Sherburne, and on the high end was Somerville. So definitely that is a main driver there. And then another interesting takeaway from our discussion is that a lot of the stormwater regulations folks are enacting are actually driven by flooding and flooding concerns, and and or also kind of just the perception of flooding concerns and the maybe public's awareness potentially of flooding over awareness of water quality issues. And I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, Jeremy, do you want to report out?
Yeah, something we talked about a lot was kind of, there's a lot of different considerations that go into whether it is like where is the best place for your community to set your threshold and the level of requirement, because as I think we were kind of getting into before, is if you set a lower threshold, that obviously increases the number of projects that are captured, which is a good thing just sort of overall in terms of water quality and flooding, but it also generates a lot more work for municipal staff and can sort of reduce the cost effectiveness. And certainly when you set a lower threshold, you're going to get a high number of those smaller projects, which might entail you have to track down like a 1 or 2 family residential project and explain to them the details of some kind of stormwater system, which is a lot of work for very little reward. Whereas the larger projects, even, setting aside the RDA question, these larger projects probably have an engineering firm who understands stormwater removal to some extent, and it's going to be much more reward for the man hours being spent. But so, more lower threshold equals more progress, but also more work. And so I think there's definitely decisions to be made on a community by community basis on where on that kind of axis is the best place to sit. But the possibility of, something like a stormwater utility fee to create more funding to hire staff, or some kind of centralized resource to offload some of that workload, or putting some of the workload more on the developers and engineers of, maybe they have to produce the phosphorus calculations and submit that with their plans. There's a variety of ways to kind of mitigate some of those competing imperatives.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jamie, do you want to share from the last group?
Yes, very, very similar. On paper, this looks easy and really beneficial, but there are challenges with adoption at the municipal level, coordinating between multiple departments that don't always coordinate with each other, and then questions of who has responsibility and enforcement authority. These are things that, like I said, seem like they're straightforward, but can get tricky internally. Also had the same kind of discussion that lowering the threshold means more staff time and more review, and that's a difficult challenge, particularly for smaller towns. And then we kind of talked about, would the region benefit from a more regional strategy, or is this kind of very unique to communities, as all communities are different? And I think it was the latter that was chosen. Like every community's a little bit different in its composition and makeup and personnel, that is hard to kind of streamline a template. But there are templates that exist, like Mass Audubon has their template that's out there, and so I don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel, but every community kind of is a unique experiment, I guess.
Thanks, Jamie. All right. Well, I apologize because we are rapidly approaching 11 o'clock. So I think what we'll try and do is go through the remaining slides very quickly. Anybody who needs to drop off, this recording will be available, and we will also share the slides in the final report when all of that's ready. But we're going to talk very quickly about some interesting projects and then try and solicit some feedback on, where do we go from here? So if you can stay with us, we'd love it. And we'll try and wrap up by 11:10. All right. So just very quickly, you go ahead to that next slide. We're going to talk about some interesting projects. One project that's very unique is Franklin has a really established rain barrel program. They've given out close to 600 rain barrels and are actually calculating the phosphorus load from each rain barrel, at a municipal cost of $50 per barrel. This is potentially a really, really cost-effective BMP, but there's, some questions. It's kind of unique. It's kind of a new strategy. But if this is, this is something that's worth pursuing, it's something that could be really widely applicable. We also thought wanted to highlight the work that Brookline has done on their prioritization of right-of-way BMPs. They did a very, very comprehensive analysis of all of the roadways in their town and looking at the drainage area that was contributing to their roadways, looking at the suitability of their soils and the catchment size. And I think that this is a really good example. I think kind of understanding the opportunity for right-of-way BMPs is very relevant to all towns. And I think the way Brookline approached this makes a lot of sense. A second thing to highlight is again from Franklin. They have a pathway towards their 25% reduction that really focuses on retrofitting older detention ponds and turning them into infiltration systems. This is a really interesting idea. They've done enough legwork to show that this is a viable strategy for them, and potentially a pretty cost-effective strategy. So just three interesting strategies among many others. Next slide. Another kind of interesting item that came out of this review was there are towns that are thinking about existing water bodies and how their drainage systems works. For instance, Brookline is looking at the feasibility of directing a large drainage area into a water body that used to be used as a reservoir, and thinking of that as a treatment BMP, as a wet pond. And Waltham has done a lot of work to kind of understand the way that their MS4 system actually drains into Cambridge's reservoir, and to see whether or not it would be appropriate to kind of claim credit for some of the treatment that's happening in that reservoir. So I think these are both really kind of interesting, emergent ideas, things that I'm sure we'll be talking more about in the future. But I just wanted to, raise that for everybody in this group to know that this is happening. Next slide. Yeah, I'll go through this, super quickly. Just and Jamie, maybe you can jump in on this as well. The focus here is identifying the low-hanging fruit, finding those cost-effective projects. We think that we've seen many towns be successful kind of inventorying existing BMPs on private property and maximizing their credits from non-structural controls, and then looking at these larger public projects. Next slide. And I think instead of doing this as a breakout room, maybe we'll have this be the last kind of piece of the conversation. And we'll just kind of, I think we've started to cover this in a nice way from that kind of first discussion break. But, a little bit more specifically, we kind of were talking about what feedback do we want to give to EPA. I think the question here is, what resources are we collectively missing? What are gaps? What are opportunities for regional collaboration? Is that information sharing? Is it data management infrastructure? So I'd love to I'll just invite anybody to kind of contribute to this conversation as they feel inspired. And I'm also going to catch up on this good conversation that's happening in the chat. See, we're planning some field trips. Yeah, Luchika, please.
Sorry, I'm struggling with pressing buttons right now. I think I'm speaking for a lot of us when I say that we have multiple tracking spreadsheets developed by multiple nonprofit and consultant firms to track phosphorus control. Sometimes it's overwhelming knowing which so-called tools are better than others. So I don't know if I'm truly answering question 1 or maybe 3. I would love to see an online tool that's available for everybody. I know we've talked about this for years, where, we can ask the developers or even us as municipalities, we can put that information in at the time of the permits. So then it's available for everybody. It's available for EPA. It's available for residents to look at. It's just a unified sort of tracking system, as opposed to everybody keeping their own spreadsheets and calculations and in the background. So I think I brought this up at the RDA focus group meeting with EPA, right? I know on the CSO control and notification program, DEP developed an online portal for people to plug in information. And I don't know what the capabilities of, I guess it would have to be EPA Region 1 to manage this type of online tracking system. It would save so much time, so much money.
So I'll just jump in real quick. We have developed this. It's called the Pollutant Tracking and Accounting Program, PTAP for short, for the New Hampshire Great Bay communities. There's no reason why it couldn't be expanded. I will say that no system is perfect. I mean, every consultant here could develop a online tracking and accounting. The real key is working on that consistency. So no system is going to be perfect, but choosing one system, I think there's a huge benefit, and making tracking and counting regionally consistent across the watershed at minimum. So, I'm certainly happy to talk about what we've done in the Great Bay and how PTAP works and operates, but it does exactly that, and we're able to provide annual reports that demonstrate the growing trend of phosphorus and nitrogen reductions, because we're concerned about nitrogen as well in the Great Bay, but we also can track phosphorus. So there are elements, but again, that the Long Island Sound has been looking into this for almost a decade and haven't really come to a consensus. The Chesapeake has a system that they've been using for the last 20 years, and it's a high-end model. And so flexibility is a little bit difficult, right? Because once the credits are ironed out, it's really hard to adapt them. And on the scientific front, this is one of the most exciting things, to see all the innovation that's happening and to understand these credits are rapidly changing as we improve and as we learn more through our implementation. That's one of the most exciting things, So in the Great Bay, when we were looking at options, we didn't want to go with a high-end model that wasn't flexible and able to incorporate the latest and the greatest science. So, that's one of the reasons why we went with PTAP and created our own. Like I said, it's really identifying the tool and then getting everybody on board. That's it. That human dimension is a difficult step.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Luchika. I feel like that was like you cut to the quick with that comment. And especially with the RDA coming out, I feel like it's going to be extra important that there's one consistent way to track BMPs. We have to figure out how to get there together. Maybe it's just starting with the PTAP and seeing if that can meet our needs. All right. Any kind of final thoughts here, and then we'll just say thank you and wrap up. And Eilish is commenting that these collaborative workshops are helpful. So we really appreciate that. I'm glad that it's very informative for me, and I'm glad others are getting something out of this too. All right, Amber, why don't you just go ahead to go ahead, Eilish.
I'm sorry, just a quick question. Is there a central location where we can find all of the town's phosphorus control plans instead of having to hunt them down one by one?
Yes, absolutely. It's not up yet, but it will be on our Stormwater page. And I will send a link to that page so that everybody's got the URL very clearly and directly. And we'll be following also up with just, probably a brief survey based on these discussions, and then a link to the presentation and a link to the recording. Yeah, Maria.
The only thing I could think of on your last slide with opportunities for collaboration in the region would be to have a training for private homeowners or commercial, and maybe they're separate trainings that teach them how to maintain their own systems that are in good ground. I think that could be something we could do instead of town by town, could be by region.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you, Maria.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
All right. Well, we're at 11:11, and I'll just say, thank you so much to everybody. Thanks for bearing with us through these 2 hours. And this is just the next step in the conversation. I feel like we already have some really good follow-up to do together. but we will be posting all this online, and encourage you to just reach out to us directly, as you think of opportunities to work together. But we'll definitely be sharing back some of the feedback that we got from this group. So thank you so much, and thank you, Mass DEP, for funding this project. And have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Max, do you want to do any debrief, or?
I think we can, yeah. Well, thank you guys a lot. I mean, I think we can do a debrief. Maybe we can kind of, as we're putting together the final report, we can do a quick check-in. And we'll be writing this up a little bit too, and we'd love your feedback on that before we send it out.
Yeah, great job, everyone. You did it.
Yeah.